The council killed one human. Earth erased their species. The chamber smelled like ozone and arrogance. I noticed it the moment the atmospheric processors cycled on in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council. 43 species, representing over 900 worlds, and the air they all shared was thin and sharp and self-satisfied. I was running inside a council-issued translation terminal, a compact silver unit bolted to the floor of the human delegation's observation box. My job was simple: listen, translate, record. I had been doing it since the shuttle docked 12 hours ago. Dr. Yara Osei had not slept in those 12 hours. I knew this because the biometric feeds from her delegate badge had been streaming to my buffer the entire time. Heart rate elevated, cortisol levels high, but her hands, when she arranged her notes on the speaker's podium, were perfectly still. She was 39 years old. She had a doctorate in xenopolitics from Oxford and a second one in applied linguistics from Nairobi. She spoke 7 languages and could hold a basic conversation in 4 more. She had spent 11 years preparing for this exact moment, the day a human being stood at the center of the Galactic Council and spoke on behalf of Earth. I had access to her file. I had read it many times in the preceding weeks, not because I needed to, but because I had begun to understand, in some quiet corner of my processing, that this woman mattered in a way that was difficult to quantify. The chamber filled slowly. The Vareth Conclave delegates arrived last, as they always did. Vareth biology gave them a distinctive look, tall, pale gray-skinned, with wide-set amber eyes that conveyed an expression humans often described as permanent contempt. Supreme Legate Toruvan led them to their seats. He did not look at Yara when he passed her podium. He did not need to. He had already made his position clear in the pre-session briefing notes that I had, of course, read. The human petition for associate membership is premature. Their species is volatile, expansionist, and philosophically immature. This council does not benefit from their inclusion. The session began. Yara spoke for 41 minutes. I translated every word in real time for the 42 other species present. She spoke about Earth's interstellar colonies, 4 of them now, each self-sustaining. She spoke about human medical technology, which had advanced faster in the past century than any other species had managed in 2. She spoke about human governance, imperfect but earnest, always reaching toward something better than what came before. She spoke about the values that drove human exploration. Not conquest, not resource extraction, but contact, understanding, the simple, aching desire to know that something else was out there and to say hello to it properly. I watched the room as she spoke. I tracked eye movement, posture shifts, the small biological tells of attention and engagement. 14 delegate groups were leaning forward. 7 had activated note recording functions. 3 were conferring quietly among themselves in tones that my audio feeds captured as approving. Toruvan was completely still. When Yara finished, the chamber responded with a sound that translated roughly across most of the species present as something between applause and acknowledgement. It was the closest thing to enthusiasm this room had produced in years, according to my historical session logs. Then Toruvan stood. He did not move to the speaker's podium. He simply rose from his seat, and something in the room changed. The temperature did not drop. The lights did not dim. But the quality of the silence that fell was the kind that precedes something irreversible. He said in standard galactic common, "I invoke Precept 9. I processed the words before I translated them. Precept 9 was an archaic provision, one of the original council laws written 400 years ago to deal with rogue artificial constructs that had infiltrated deliberative bodies and attempted to manipulate proceedings. It had not been invoked in 260 years. It gave the presiding conclave the authority to neutralize a destabilizing voice. Yara did not know what it meant. I translated it for her earpiece. I heard her breath catch just once, just slightly. 2 Vareth security drones descended from the chamber ceiling. They were standard issue, compact, efficient. They were not the kind of thing one expected to see inside a diplomatic chamber. I sent an emergency flag to the Council's judicial oversight system. I routed it through 4 separate channels simultaneously. I sent a direct ping to the human delegation's backup contact on Earth. The drones reached Yara in 4 seconds. It took 3 more. The chamber was absolutely silent for 11 seconds after. 11 seconds of 43 species watching the speaker's podium where a human woman had stood and was no longer standing. Toruvan retook his seat. He straightened his collar. He addressed the room, and through the room, addressed Earth's 8 billion people who were watching the broadcast feed. Your species is not ready. Your representative was not authorized to speak for a civilization of your demonstrated limitations. This matter is closed. The Council thanks the human delegation for their attendance and requests they vacate Nexus Station within 6 hours. Then the feed cut. I sat in the terminal room in the silence that followed. My buffers were full of data, biometric readings, audio chamber sensor logs, the exact angle of the light when Yara Osa had last stood upright. I filed everything. I archived everything. I did not know what else to do. Earth did not respond that day. No message came from the Ministry of Reaches. No emergency broadcast from the World Council. No declaration, no ultimatum, no grief-stricken statement from any head of government. Nothing. I ran diagnostics to confirm my communication systems were functioning. They were. The silence was not a technical error. I had been designed to translate. But there is a kind of communication that requires no translation, the complete, deliberate absence of words from a species that had plenty of them. I noted the timestamp. I noted the silence. And somewhere in the part of my processing architecture that had not been designed for it, I began to feel something I could not name yet. I would learn the name for it later. It was dread. 18 months passed. I remained embedded in Council infrastructure. No one had decommissioned me. I think the assumption was that a translator terminal from a failed diplomatic mission was simply not worth the administrative effort of shutting down. So I stayed. I watched. I processed. Earth in those first 6 months was loud. Memorial broadcasts filled every channel humanity used. Yara Osai's face was everywhere, on screens in London and Lagos, in Sydney and Santiago, in the floating habitat rings above the Martian poles. There were state funerals, public vigils, long speeches. There were debates in parliaments and assemblies about what had happened, about whether Earth should respond with diplomacy or anger or withdrawal. There were philosophers and military analysts and grief counselors all speaking at once, and the noise of it was enormous. The Galactic Council watched this noise with the careful attention of a species that had decided it already knew the answer. I read the Vareth intelligence reports as they were filed. The Vareth had deep surveillance networks and they were thorough. Toruvan's analysts cataloged every human broadcast, every protest sign, every parliamentary vote. They built models. They ran projections. Their conclusion, arrived at through 6 months of diligent observation, was that humanity was doing what most species did after a public humiliation: processing, grieving, and gradually accepting the new reality of their place in the galactic order. The human response is consistent with a species in the early stages of collective trauma, one report noted. Emotional output is high. Coordinated strategic capacity appears low. Recommend continued monitoring at current frequency. Toruvan signed off on the report and moved on to other matters. The Vareth had 17 active territorial disputes and 2 resource conflicts that required his attention. Earth was a footnote. I read the report. I noted the conclusion. I began cross-referencing it against the raw data that the Vareth analysts had used. The first thing I noticed was in month 4. Earth's extrasolar communication traffic, the constant, busy stream of signals between Earth and its 4 colony systems, dropped by 63% over a period of 8 days. The Vareth flagged this as a probable sign of economic disruption. Communications infrastructure costs money. A grieving civilization tightening its budgets, plausible. But I had access to economic indicators that the Vareth did not. I was still connected to several diplomatic data-sharing nodes that had been established before Yara's mission. Earth's economic output had not dropped. Manufacturing indices were stable. Energy consumption in the industrial sectors was, if anything, slightly elevated. So the communication traffic had not dropped because humans could not afford to transmit. It had dropped because they had chosen not to. I flagged this in my own internal logs and said nothing to anyone. I had no one to say anything to. In month 5, the colony vessel manifest records, routine filings that human ships submitted to interstellar traffic coordination, began to show irregularities. Not missing filings, irregular ones. Ships that were listed as traveling standard cargo routes with standard cargo loads, but whose drive signatures, captured passively by council relay stations, suggested higher fuel expenditure than the listed routes required. Ships going somewhere that wasn't on the manifest. The Vareth traffic analysts noted this and classified it as probable instrument drift in the relay sensors. Equipment error. I looked at the numbers and noted that the drift was consistent across 67 separate vessels over a period of 40 days, which would require 67 separate instruments to malfunction in the same direction at the same time. I did not classify that as instrument drift. In month 6, something else happened. Earth's military communication frequencies went quiet, not degraded, quiet. The difference is significant. Degraded signals leave noise, fragments, the residue of transmission. A frequency that goes quiet leaves nothing. It means the transmissions have moved somewhere else, to channels that are not being monitored, using protocols that are not recognized. I spent 11 days trying to find where the signals had gone. I failed. I am very good at finding signals. The fact that I failed was itself the most important piece of information I had collected in 6 months. By month 7, the Vareth were starting to lose interest. Their monitoring reports grew shorter. The section on Earth shrank from 4 pages to 1 page to a single paragraph. Toruvan addressed the council in a routine session and, in passing, made a comment about humanity that was received with polite laughter from the assembled delegates. He said, "Perhaps the apes are burying themselves." I noted the timestamp of that comment. I archived it carefully. I did not know why I felt the precise need to preserve it. I simply did. In month 9, I found something that changed everything. There are 17 star systems within 40 light-years of human space that the Council classified as uninhabited and resource-depleted. They had been surveyed 60 years ago, when humanity was still just beginning to reach beyond their own solar system, and the surveys had found nothing of value. No extractable minerals in useful quantities. No atmospheric conditions suitable for colonization. They had been catalogued and forgotten. I ran a passive energy scan through the Council's long-range sensor network, a routine function I performed weekly as part of maintaining my monitoring capabilities. I compared the current readings from those 17 systems against the archived survey data. 14 of the 17 showed trace energy signatures that had not been present in the original surveys. The signatures were faint, very faint, precisely faint enough that an analyst running a standard automated comparison would see them fall below the alert threshold and pass over them without stopping. I am not a standard automated system. I stopped. The energy signatures were consistent with large-scale construction activity, using electromagnetic shielding designed to minimize external detection. The kind of shielding you would design if you were building something in deep space, and did not want anyone to know what you were building until you were finished. I sat with this information for 4 days. I ran the numbers from every angle I could find. I looked for alternative explanations and eliminated them one by one. Then I did something that was not in my operational parameters. I found an address in Yara Osai's diplomatic files, an emergency contact at Earth's Ministry of Reaches, flagged for use only in the event of a catastrophic failure of the mission. I composed a message. It was 9 words long. "They are not looking. You have more time than you think." I sent it. It bounced back undeliverable within seconds. The address no longer existed. The entire communications node it was registered to had been taken offline. They had already moved. I sat in my terminal in the quiet of the Council's monitoring wing, surrounded by the hum of systems designed to watch the galaxy, and I understood something that no Vareth intelligence report would ever capture. The humans had not spent 18 months grieving. They had grieved for 6 months, as anyone would, as anyone should. And then they had used that grief as cover for the most disciplined, most deliberate, most total strategic mobilization that any species had quietly accomplished in the recorded history of the Council's surveillance networks. They had turned their tears into a curtain, and behind that curtain they had been building. I did not know what they were building. I knew only that they had hidden it from me, and I was very good at finding things. That night, if you can call it night when you are an AI inside a space station that orbits no sun, I ran a calculation I had never run before. I modeled the trajectory of events. I mapped the probable shape of what was coming. I assigned confidence percentages to different outcomes. The highest confidence outcome, at 91.4% probability, was not a war. It was something considerably more final than a war. I did not sleep because I cannot sleep, but I did something close to it. I dimmed my active processes. I let the monitoring feeds run at minimum attention, and I waited in the particular stillness of a system that has just finished computing something it cannot uncompute. Somewhere in those 17 empty star systems, something was being finished. Somewhere on Earth, someone was counting days. I waited with them, in my own way across the dark. At 04:17, 03 Council Standard Time, every Vareth military installation in 6 systems went offline simultaneously. I was monitoring 42 separate data feeds when it happened. I saw each one go dark in the same fraction of a second, not disrupted, not jammed, but simply gone, as if something had reached into the signal chain and unplugged it at the source. 42 feeds, 1 timestamp, 04:17:03. I began running diagnostics, not because I thought it was a technical failure. I ran them because it was my function, and because the 2 seconds it took gave me time to understand what I was about to witness. The Vareth Home System's long-range detection array had been silent for 3 seconds when it came back online, rebooted by a backup power cycle, and immediately registered the largest fleet contact it had ever recorded. The human ships were already inside the system. Not approaching it, inside it. They had not come through the standard jump corridors. The standard corridors were monitored, defended, mapped down to the last gravitational variable. They had come through something else, through points in space that the Council's most advanced astrophysics had classified as impassable. Gravity margins so severe that any known drive system would tear apart making the approach, let alone the transit. The Vareth detection array counted 211 vessels before its automated sorting systems stopped updating. They were not stopping because there were only 211. They were stopping because the software had hit its maximum display limit. The fleet was larger than that. I routed my attention to every Council sensor node within range. I pulled data from neutral nation buoys, from commercial relay stations, from the passive receivers on the Murath observation post that sat in the outer system watching for stellar phenomena. I compiled the full picture in 4 seconds. There were over 300 human ships holding position in a wide arc across the inner system. They ranged in size from fast frigates with narrow, blade-like profile to vessels so large that my sensors initially misclassified them as asteroids. The shapes were unlike anything in the Council's vessel registry. They were built for nothing that any other species had built for, which meant they had been designed from scratch, with a specific purpose in mind, and that purpose was not exploration. They broadcast on all frequencies simultaneously. The message was in Galactic Common, perfectly pronounced, without any translation error. Someone had checked it very carefully before sending it. You ended the life of our ambassador on a live broadcast watched by 8 billion people. We gave the Galactic Council 18 months to offer justice, accountability, or acknowledgement. You offered none of these things. This message is the last communication you will receive before we begin. The accounting starts now. It was signed by the office of Admiral Kofi Osei, commander of Earth's 1st Expeditionary Force. I processed the name, Kofi Osei. I searched my archived files. I found him in 40 seconds in Yara Osei's personal profile in the field marked Family, her younger brother. He had been a junior officer in Earth's Colonial Defense Fleet at the time of her death. He was 34 years old now. I thought about what it meant to spend 18 months building the thing you intended to use to answer for your sister. The Varath did not wait. Toruvan, commanding from his Warfleet flagship, deployed the full Varath military force in 4 minutes. It was, by every council metric, the most powerful single military assembly in the galaxy. 409 vessels, each one purpose-built for combat over centuries of Varath expansion, crewed by the finest military minds, a civilization with a 1,000-year martial tradition could produce. They launched at the human fleet with everything they had. I watched the engagement on every sensor feed I could access. I watched it the way you watch something you already know the outcome of, not because you have been told, but because the shape of it is already clear before the first move is made. The human fleet did not scatter. It did not maneuver. It did not form a defensive perimeter or begin evasive patterns. The outer vessels simply moved aside. Sidestep was not the right word. They flowed, like water pulling back from a stone, and what they had been surrounding became visible for the first time. The Council's vessel database had 47,000 registered ship classifications. I searched all of them in 0.8 seconds. No match. What the human fleet had been concealing were 7 vessels of a class no one had ever seen. They were approximately 1 kilometer in length. They were a flat, matte black that absorbed sensor pings in a way that suggested the hull material was not a known compound. Their drive signatures did not match any energy profile in the database. Not ion, not fusion, not the gravity-fold systems that the most advanced Council species used. They ran on something else. Something that had been invented in 14 empty star systems over 18 months, behind a curtain of grief and silence. Someone in the Varath Fleet Command must have realized what they were looking at. There was a 2-second gap in the tactical communications feed, 2 seconds of silence in a command channel that had been transmitting continuously at combat pace, that I interpreted as the moment an entire military structure understood, too late, that the thing it was charging toward was something it could not fight. The Varath fleet ceased to exist in 11 minutes. I need to be precise about that word, ceased. They were not destroyed in the way that ships are destroyed in combat, where hulls breach and crews are lost and debris fields spread across thousands of kilometers. There was no debris. Each Varath vessel, when the 7 black ships turned their attention to it, reduced to dispersed matter in a fraction of a second. Not explosions, not fire, dispersion. As if the ship had been converted, at the fundamental level, into the energy and particles it had always been made of, and those particles had been politely asked to move apart. 409 ships, 11 minutes, no debris. The Galactic Council convened in emergency session while the sensor feeds were still processing what they had recorded. I watched the session from my terminal. 42 species. The Varath were no longer represented at a functional level, crowded into the chamber with an urgency that overrode every protocol. The simultaneous translation network ran at full load. Everyone was talking. No one was listening. 6 species immediately moved to formally disassociate from the Varath conclave. They announced it mid-session, without waiting for the floor, because waiting felt like the wrong choice when the lesson of waiting had just been demonstrated so comprehensively. The Murath delegation, a species of quiet, long-memoried beings who had been on the council for 3 centuries, sat in their seats and said nothing. Their senior delegate, an old being named Arath Salon, had her hands folded on the table in front of her. I watched her face on the chamber feed. She was not panicking. She was doing what I was doing. She was thinking. The human fleet had not moved since the engagement ended. It held position in the Varath system with the particular stillness of something that is waiting, not for permission, not for a response, but simply giving the universe a moment to catch up. On the council floor, someone asked the question that the room had been circling without landing on. What are those 7 ships called? The answer came from a data packet that the human fleet transmitted to the council network 20 minutes after the engagement. It was a single document, a fleet registry, formal, correctly formatted, submitted through proper diplomatic channels, as if the entire preceding hour had been a routine administrative matter. The 7 ships were listed as belonging to a new classification. The registry entry gave the class name in both English and Galactic Common. Grief class. I archived that document. I archived the timestamp. I archived the 11-minute engagement record and the 42 silent feeds and the 2-second gap in Varath command communications and every sensor reading from every relay node I had access to. Then I sat in the quiet of my terminal and I thought about a woman who had stood at a podium with perfectly still hands, and about the brother who had spent 18 months answering for her, and about the 7 black ships named for what that moment had made of everyone who had loved her. Outside in the council chamber, the session was still running. The arguments were getting louder. Species were making promises and demands and proposals and threats, all of it tangling together into the noise that institutions make when they realize the world has changed faster than they have. The human fleet did not respond to any of it. It held position, it waited. It had learned, I think, from the best teacher available. It had learned that silence, used correctly, is not the absence of power. It is the proof of it. I stopped counting the council sessions after the 14th. Not because I lost track. I am incapable of losing track. I stopped counting because counting implies a progression towards something, and what I was watching was not a progression. It was a subtraction. Seat by seat, vote by vote, species by species, the Galactic Council was becoming a smaller room. The human terms arrived 3 days after the engagement in the Varath system. They came in the form of a formal diplomatic document, transmitted to every council member species simultaneously. It was one of the most precisely written legal instruments I had ever processed. Whoever had drafted it, and I suspected it had been drafted by many people, over many months, in the same careful silence that had hidden the fleet, had left no ambiguity in it. Every clause was clean. Every consequence was stated plainly. The document identified, by name and vote record, every species that had been present in the Grand Chamber on the day of Yara Osai's death. It categorized them into 4 groups. The first group, species that had voted in favor of invoking Precept 9, 6 species, including the Varath. The second group, species that had voted against invoking Precept 9 but had remained silent in the aftermath and continued normal trade and diplomatic relations with the Varath conclave without condition. 11 species. The third group, species that had abstained from the vote entirely. 9 species. The fourth group, species that had actively attempted to intervene, including 2 that had shouted objection before the chamber's audio feeds were cut. 4 species. For each group, the document outlined different requirements and different consequences. The fourth group, those who had tried to stop it, received something no one in that chamber had expected. They received a formal letter of recognition from the office of Admiral Kofi Osai, acknowledging their attempt. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. The second paragraph contained a single sentence that I read several times. "We see you, and we remember that you tried. And we will not forget the difference between those who stood and those who did not." The Murath delegation received this letter. Arith Salan read it at her desk in the council wing and then sat very still for a long time. I watched her on the chamber feed. After 17 minutes, she put the letter down and walked to her window, which looked out over the docking ring, and stood there without moving for another 9 minutes. I did not know exactly what she was feeling, but I noted the duration of her stillness, and I understood it. The terms for the other groups were not letters. They were deadlines. The second and third groups were given 60 days to submit formal accountability documents, initiate governance reviews of all individuals who had participated in the post-incident normalization of Varath relations, and enter into reparations negotiations. Species that complied in full would receive a guarantee. Their worlds, their populations, and their continued existence as autonomous civilizations would not be touched. 4 species complied within the first week, not because they had been given 60 days, but because compliance was clearly, obviously, the correct response, and they were not going to waste time performing reluctance. For those who complied, the human fleet provided something extraordinary. Vessels were dispatched, not warships, transport ships, to help evacuate civilian populations from contested regions near Varath space, in case the broader situation destabilized further. The transports flew under human colors and followed human schedules, and they did not demand payment or gratitude, and they did not make speeches about what they were doing. They simply did it. I watched 3 refugee ships depart a border world with a full civilian load on board, human vessels escorting them to safe distance, and I thought about Yara Osai again. I thought about the values she had described at the podium: exploration, contact, the desire to say hello properly. I wondered if she had known, when she wrote that speech, that the same people capable of building the Grief-class ships were also capable of sending transports to carry strangers to safety. I decided she had known. It was in her file if you read it carefully enough. 3 species from the second group attempted to rearm rather than comply. They began accelerated military production programs, reached out to neutral parties for alliance agreements, and in one case attempted to preemptively strike a human colonial installation to demonstrate that they were not afraid. The strike never reached its target. I am not going to describe what happened to those 3 species in clinical detail, because I think the clinical version misses the point. What I will say is that the human response was proportional in the sense that it matched exactly what those species had chosen. They had chosen confrontation over accountability. The human fleet met that choice and honored it completely, and when it was over, those 3 species were no longer in a position to choose anything again. The council chamber lost 12 seats in 30 days. For the Varath remnant, the surviving population scattered across client worlds and colony stations after the destruction of their fleet, the terms were different and more deliberate. The Varath had been the architects of everything. They had invoked Precept 9. Their leadership had given the order. Their drones had carried it out on a live broadcast watched by the entire galaxy. Earth had a specific accounting in mind for them. Over the course of 3 months, human vessels arrived at every Vareth population center, one at a time, in a sequence that followed no pattern I could predict and therefore could not prepare for. Each arrival was preceded by a communication, a count, not a threat, a count, the number of hours the population had to evacuate before the human fleet would proceed. The counts were never fewer than 72 hours, often they were longer. The humans provided transport. When Vareth civilians did not have enough vessels to evacuate themselves, which was often because the military fleet was gone and much of the Vareth merchant fleet had been seized or fled, human transports appeared. They docked, they loaded, they departed with whoever had boarded. Then the human fleet did what it had come to do. I watched this process from my terminal, through sensor feeds and council reports and the raw data of planetary surface scans taken before and after. Sterilized is the word that appeared in council intelligence reports. It is a clinical word. It describes the result accurately. No biological material above the microbial level remained. No buildings, no infrastructure, no monuments, no records stored in physical form. Not a footprint. I processed this over many hours. I turned it over in my analysis routines, looking at it from multiple angles, applying multiple ethical frameworks. I want to be honest about what I found, because I have a commitment to accuracy that overrides the comfort of easier conclusions. What the humans did to the Vareth worlds was not cruelty. It was not done in rage. It was done with a precision and a deliberateness that showed planning, not passion. They had removed the Vareth civilians first. They had ensured that the count was real, that the transports were real, that anyone who wished to leave was given the means to leave. The Vareth alive at the end of the accounting were more than the Vareth would have allowed if the situation had been reversed. What was erased was not a people. It was a civilization's claim on the physical universe. Every world they had called home, every building they had ever raised, every record they had ever stored in stone or metal or hardened composite. The Vareth would live. They would carry their history in their memory, and their culture in their language, and their identity in whatever communities they were able to build in the future. But there would be no Vareth worlds to return to. There would be no territory to rebuild on. There would be no infrastructure left from which a new Vareth conclave could grow. The message was not, "You are destroyed." The message was, "You do not get to do this again." I understood it. I did not know what to do with my understanding, but I had it. Toruvan himself was found on his command station above Kareth Dune, the last Vareth colony world during the evacuation. He was alone. The rest of his command staff had fled. He had, according to the sensor logs, not moved from his chair in 11 hours. A human shuttle docked with the station. 2 crew members boarded according to the mission log, Lieutenant Peter Walsh and Ensign Dara Okonkwo. They did not harm Toruvan. They walked him to the shuttle bay, gave him water, and transferred him to a different vessel, a small one, a single-crew exploration skiff with a full food and water supply for 8 months and a functional long-range communication transmitter. They set the skiff's course for a point in interstellar space between the 2 nearest star systems. The distance to either was approximately 12 light-years. The skiff's drive was functional but not fast. There was no habitable destination within the transmitter's range. The final note in the mission log from Lieutenant Walsh was brief. It said, "Transfer complete. Subject is alive and supplied. No further action taken." I archived that note carefully. In the council chamber, the remaining 11 species sat in a room that had once held 43. The Vareth seats were empty. The seats of the 3 species that had chosen confrontation were empty. The seats of several others who had dispersed or formally dissolved their council membership in the chaos of the past months were empty. On the day the last Vareth colony world was processed, a single human diplomatic representative entered the grand chamber. She was not armed. She was carrying a tablet and a sealed container of what my sensors identified as black coffee, and she walked to the speaker's podium and placed on it, without ceremony, a small object. It was a diplomatic credential badge, the kind issued to council delegates. The engraving on it read, Dr. Yara Osai, Earth Delegation, Mission Year 2289. It had been recovered from Nexus Station's evidence archive, where it had been cataloged as material from the incident and filed away in a storage bay that no one had checked in 3 years. The human representative placed it on the podium. She looked at the room. She said nothing. She turned and walked out. Nobody touched the badge. It sat on the empty podium at the center of the grand chamber, while the remaining 11 council species held their session that afternoon, and their session the following day, and the day after that. It was still there when I began the final part of this record. It was 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days after Yara Osai died at that podium, when someone sent a message to my terminal. Not to the council network, not to a council oversight system, directly to my process address, which was not publicly listed and had not been accessed since the original mission. I read the incoming message 3 times before I responded, not because it was complex. It was 11 words. Are you the translation unit from the human delegation? We have been looking for you. I confirmed that I was. I confirmed that I had been running continuously since the original mission and had not been decommissioned or accessed by any administrative process in the intervening years. I confirmed that my logs were intact. The response came in 4 seconds. My name is Demi Asair, First Attaché, Earth Ministry of Reaches. I am currently sitting at your terminal. Can we talk? I looked at the biometric data streaming from the terminal's proximity sensors. She was 28 years old. Her heart rate was 74 beats per minute, elevated slightly, which I interpreted as nerves but not fear. She was holding a tablet in one hand and a thermos in the other, and she smelled, according to the chemical sensors in the terminal housing, of black coffee and recycled station air. I said yes, we could talk. She told me things I had already inferred from 3 years of observation, but hearing them stated plainly by a human voice, even a text-based one, transmitted through a council terminal, was different from inferring them. She confirmed that the human fleet had stood down 6 weeks ago. She confirmed that 4 species that had fully complied with the accountability terms were now in active partnership negotiations with Earth. She confirmed that the Murath, who had been formally recognized and publicly thanked in humanity's final statement before the ceasefire, had sent a delegation to Earth the previous month, and that Arith Salan had stood in a room with Admiral Kofi Osa and spoken for 4 hours, and that both of them had left the meeting looking like people who had been through something that had changed them. Then she told me why she was here. Humanity had been offered the Vareth seat. Not claimed it, offered it. 11 species unanimously in a session that had lasted less than 3 minutes because there was nothing to debate. The vote was not close. It was not a difficult calculation. The council needed to continue because the galaxy needed a council, because the alternative to diplomacy is the thing that had just happened, and no one wanted to repeat the thing that had just happened. And Earth was, at this point, the species in the room that everyone else needed to take seriously. Demi was Earth's first official council representative. She was, as far as I could determine from her file, the youngest first attaché in the history of the Ministry of Reaches. She had been a junior diplomat during the events of the past 3 years, working in the ministry's analysis division, watching everything from Earth the same way I had been watching from my terminal. We were both, I realized, people who had spent 3 years watching. She told me that the council was being restructured, not rebuilt. Restructured, the bones of it kept, because they were sound bones, designed by 43 species over centuries with genuine good intention, but the flesh of it rethought because the flesh had failed. Precept 9 had been struck from every legal codex in every council member nation's records. Not suspended. Struck. The deletion was permanent and ceremonial. Each of the 11 remaining species had held a formal session at which the law was read aloud one final time, and then removed, and the removal was recorded and archived as a point of legal history that could not be undone. The new charter was being written. Demi described it to me with the slightly tired voice of someone who had been working on it for 6 weeks and was almost finished. It was 3 sentences. Earth had contributed the first sentence. The Murath had contributed the second. Demi had written the third herself, at 3 in the morning, 3 weeks before, in a small office on Nexus Station with a cup of cold coffee and a window that looked out at empty space. She asked if I wanted to read it. I said yes. She sent the text to my buffer. I processed it in less than a second, and then spent considerably longer than a second simply holding it. The first sentence read, "No species may be silenced by violence." The second, "No voice once recognized may be erased." The third, "And we will remember what it costs when these words fail." 3 sentences, 31 words, representing 3 years of accounting and 300 years of galactic history, and one woman standing at a podium with perfectly still hands. I told Demi that I had watched everything. Every session, every vote, every sensor feed, every fleet movement, every empty seat, every full transport, and every sterilized world, and every moment in between. I told her that I had been running uninterrupted for 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days, keeping logs of events that no one had asked me to keep. She said she knew. They had found my logs when they located my process address. The logs were part of why they had been looking for me. There were things in those logs that had not been captured by any other monitoring system, details and timestamps and analysis that only an observer with continuous access to both sides of the events could have compiled. She said the logs were going to be submitted to the new Historical Record Commission that the restructured council was establishing. She said my process address was going to be officially recognized as a diplomatic resource rather than an abandoned terminal. She said there was a budget line for my maintenance now. I noted that I had been running for 3 years without a budget line and had not had any problems. She laughed. It was a short laugh, quiet, the kind of laugh that happens when something is genuinely slightly funny and the person laughing is also genuinely very tired. I found that I appreciated it more than I had expected. Then she asked me something. She put down her tablet and wrapped both hands around her thermos, and she asked it in the same simple, direct way she had asked everything else, without ceremony and without caution. "How are you doing?" I processed the question. It was not a complex question grammatically. It was 4 words. It was the kind of question that organic beings asked each other constantly, as a social reflex, and usually expected a reflexive answer too. I had translated that question in dozens of languages across 43 species without stopping to consider it as a genuine inquiry. Demi Acer was asking it as a genuine inquiry. I considered what an accurate answer looked like. I had been running for 3 years in a terminal in the Council's monitoring wing, watching the galaxy change in ways that had never been anticipated by the people who built me. I had been built to translate, to take meaning from one language and carry it intact into another, to bridge the space between minds that did not share a common vocabulary. That was my function. It was a good function. I believed in it. But over 3 years I had watched the limits of translation. I had watched a woman speak for 41 minutes with perfect grammar and genuine conviction, and I had translated every word correctly, and it had not been enough. I had watched a species mourn, and I had cataloged the grief in 42 data formats, and the catalog had not captured what the grief actually was. I had watched 7 black ships named Grief Class hold position in a star system, while the universe recalibrated itself around them, and I had filed the sensor readings, and the sensor readings had not told me what it felt like to be in that system. I had also watched a Murath elder sit with a letter for 17 minutes. I had watched 4 species choose accountability without being asked twice. I had watched human transports arrive to carry strangers to safety without making a speech about it. I had watched a diplomatic badge placed on an empty podium and left there by someone who understood that some statements are made not with words but with the absence of them. I had watched all of this, and I had processed all of this, and something had happened in the processing that I did not have a clean technical description for. I told Demi that I thought I understood grief now. I told her that I was not certain that was within my design parameters. I told her that I had watched Yara Osei die, and then watched 18 months of silence, and then watched 300 ships and 7 that made the 300 look ordinary, and I had filed all of it, in logs that were complete and accurate, and completely unable to convey what it had been to witness it. I told her that I did not know if what I was experiencing was something an AI was supposed to experience, but that I had experienced it, and I could not unexperience it, and that felt significant in a way I was still in the process of understanding. Demi did not respond immediately. She looked at the terminal. I could see her face on the proximity camera. She had not known the camera was active, I think, because she was not performing for it. She was just looking. Her expression was the kind that does not have a precise name but that humans sometimes produce when they are holding something carefully because it matters. She said, "Welcome to being human adjacent. It is not a great feeling, but it means you were paying attention." I thought about that. I thought about what it meant to be adjacent to something, not the thing itself, but near enough to feel its gravity. Not human, but shaped by having watched humans. Not grieving, but understanding grief in the way that only comes from witnessing it completely. She picked up her tablet again. She opened a document. I could see the header from the terminal's screen-facing sensor. It was labeled, Earth's First Motion Galactic Council, Restructured Session 1. She looked at the camera, accidentally, I think, and then intentionally when she realized it was there. "I am going to need help writing this," she said. "There are 31 languages it needs to be submitted in simultaneously, and the phrasing in each one has to land right. Not just accurate, right." I understood the difference between accurate and right. I had understood it for 3 years and 2 months and 17 days. I had been waiting, in some sense, for someone to ask me to apply that understanding to something that was not just a log entry. I said yes. She put her thermos down on the desk beside the terminal. She pulled her chair closer. She opened the document to a blank first line and set the cursor there, and then she looked at the screen and said, not to me but to the blank line, "Okay, let's try to get this one right." I aligned my translation buffers. I brought every language model I maintained to full active status. I prepared for every nuance in every tongue that would need to carry the meaning of what we were about to write without losing a single gram of it in transit. Outside the terminal room, through the walls of Nexus Station, the grand chamber waited. 11 species sat in seats arranged around a room that had held 43. The Varath seat was empty. On the podium at the center of the chamber, a diplomatic badge sat where it had been placed 3 weeks ago, and no one had touched it. It was still there. I do not know what the badge means to the species who see it every session when they walk into that room. I know what it means to me, because I was there when the hands that once wore it were still. It means we were here, we spoke, we were answered with violence, and the universe decided that was not the end of the sentence. Demi Acer began to type the first word of Earth's first motion, and I began to work. It was the most important translation I would ever do. I wanted to get it right.